It's also worth noting that by saying that theological intolerance leads to civil effects, and that's a problem, is that he's just stripped freedom of conscience from everyone, literally. Like, this is bad stuff. You know, you'd think that we'd be surprised at this point if things got worse, but actually they do. So let's get started. This is going to be part 19. We're going to be covering book 4, chapters 8 and 9, and then we're going to be doing a kind of a conclusion and a wrap-up. Chapter 8, book 4, chapter 8 is going to be most of what's left of Rousseau's actual book. Chapter 9 is literally a single paragraph, so let's get started. Book 4, chapter 8 is titled Civil Religion, and Rousseau begins it by stating that early states were entirely based on religious principles. Quote, "No kings save the gods, and no government save theocracy," end quote. That's true only if you restrict yourself to totalitarian states, of course. There were plenty of small rulers who enjoyed limited but significant powers. Not that they were, a voluntarist paradise, but there were definitely rulers that had limited powers that weren't, necessarily saying, oh, I get my power directly from God, and therefore my power is unlimited. It's worth noting that unless the ancient pagan gods actually were giving instructions to their priest equivalents, or whatever they were called at the time, that there were actual rulers, and that they were just pretending to be getting orders from somewhere else, which is a nice little ploy. You kind of pass on responsibility, but you get all the authority. Of course, this is pretty much equivalent to Rousseau's prince getting orders from the sovereign in most cases, namely whenever the sovereign isn't actually assembled, which is most of the time. Rousseau goes on to say that each distinct people had their own god or set of gods, and that this led to war between peoples and, quote, "theological and civil intolerance, which, as we shall see hereafter, are by nature the same," end quote. But a little bit of a spoiler alert. It's not that they're by nature the same, it's that Rousseau's insistence on a totalitarian framework forces them to be identical. You can't have two separate sources of authority if authority must be 100% and no less. If you do, then the state might have to share some of its power with other institutions, and Rousseau can't have that. And it gets even worse as we go through this chapter, as you'll see. Rousseau notes that Greeks commonly claim to rediscovering their gods among barbarians to justify their rulership of those barbarians. But this was either confusion or convenient, he suggests. It seems closer to the latter to me. The classification of various mythical beings as different seems to be an exercise in arbitrariness from my perspective. How could one prove that two of these entities believed to be gods are actually different, and not only the same entity being viewed through various lenses at different times, right? It'd be like trying to come up with an alibi for a god, right? Oh, no, Your Honor, I can say definitively that my god never turned into a bull in order to seduce a woman. That's definitely that one over there. It's as you can see, there's a little bit of silliness in even the idea that you could prove such a thing. Now, Rousseau says that pagan gods were not covetous or expansionary, and that boundaries between religions or nations were generally respected. He talks about Jephthah of the ancient Jews, and how Jephthah implied that the Ammonites' god Chamos had rights of similar nature to that of his own god, which I think is whitewashing. Pagan gods were covetous and expansionary when they could get away with it, is kind of the actual closer to the truth, I believe. Groups would temporize, and they would recognize the rights of groups that they couldn't conquer at the time, and they didn't want to inflame tensions with. That I think that's way closer to actual reality than Rousseau saying, "Oh no, everybody was happy," and it's just Rousseau's hatred of institutions coming to the surface, and I don't think there's any actual historical basis behind it, and he gives none. But Rousseau continues and says that, however, when the Jews were conquered, they refused to give up their god, which their conquerors saw as rebellion or rebelliousness, and that resulted in their persecution. As long as gods and governments were inextricably linked, quote, "there was no way of converting a people except by enslaving it, and there could be no missionaries save conquerors, end quote. Now, different religions have different levels of evangelical power that they attempt, right? Rousseau is drastically oversimplifying a vast chunk of human history in a way that I think is actually intentionally discarding real nuance. He wants things to fit his framework, and so he's kind of brushing away all the things that don't fit into his framework and say, look, everything that's left fits into my framework, and don't look behind the curtain. It's a little transparent at this point. Now another quote from Rousseau. So far from men fighting for the gods, as in Homer, fought for men. Each asked his god for victory and repaid him with new altars. The Romans, before taking a city, summoned its gods to quit it. And in leaving the Tarentines, their outraged gods, they regarded them as subject to their own and compelled them to do homage. They left the vanquished their gods as they left them their laws. A wreath to the Jupiter of the capital was often the only tribute they imposed, end quote. Again, I think Rousseau is whitewashing the Roman Empire here to a mind-boggling degree, and ignoring a variety of soft and hard powers that the empire used to grow and maintain its holdings. It's very hard to prove a negative, of course, and maybe there were a number of small tribes that weren't able to provide much in way of tribute, but at the same time, I think that those tribes once conquered were certainly expected to stay conquered and not to obstruct further conquest, right? That's already asking quite a bit, and it's a lot more than simply a wreath once a year. Now, Rousseau says that the Roman cult spread with the empire, and then basically they added gods to their pantheon every time they conquered a new people, until eventually all the people under the Roman Empire recognized the same gods, and paganism was unified. I mean, unified over the Roman Empire. Yet, at the same time, the word paganism includes other religious systems that never were part of the Roman Empire as well. So Rousseau is, again, oversimplifying because it moves the argument in the direction he wants it to go. He continues by saying that Christianity attempted to separate religion from the state, which created, quote, internal divisions which have never ceased to trouble Christian peoples, end quote. He says that pagans feared Christians as, quote, rebels, feigning to submit, end quote. Of course, different sects of Christianity have attempted this to different degrees, from having a monarch head the Anglican Church to having a quote-unquote wall of separation. Again, this is way simpler. This is way more complicated than Rousseau is letting on. To be fair, the wall of separation did come after Rousseau, so, whatever. But Jefferson was not the first person to put forth that kind of idea in a letter to somebody. Then, Rousseau says, later on, Christians actually got power. They got political power, and, quote, soon this so-called kingdom of the other world turned, under a visible leader, into the most violent of earthly despotisms, end quote. Again, I think this is a bit overstated for rhetorical purposes. There were, not to say that the worst excesses of the Inquisition were not that bad. Sure, they were bad, but at the same time, there were some empires and governments in the ancient world that were pretty bad, even compared to the Inquisition. Rousseau continues by talking about jurisdictional conflict. He says that this conflict between state and religious leaders makes, quote, good polity impossible in Christian states, end quote. And the question that Rousseau brings up is, well, which should a man obey, his government or his priest? And as long as he's clinging to this totalitarian framework, he can't permit this conflict. However, if you create a genuinely limited government, assuming such a thing is possible, or if you establish government based entirely on voluntary contracts, the conflict somehow magically vanishes. Even a temporarily limited government, like, the early American government before it started taking full power over anything and claiming that, it had power over everything, even a temporarily limited government can make this work while it remains temporarily limited. It's when things go to the point where the government claims to have power to make any determination it wants that the problem arises of conflict of power, right? And we're going to see that this gets even worse as we go forward, so let's keep moving. Rousseau says that various groups tried to bring back the old system, namely the unification of religion and state, but that all eventually failed. He talks about how the King of England is the head of the church, and so are the czars of Russia, but they are more ministers than masters. They cannot change the system, Rousseau claims, but only maintain it more or less effectively. But again, this is just not true. The idea that the kings of England and the czars of Russia had no effect whatsoever on their country's religious doctrines, I think is an amazing stretch. I feel like there's an example somewhere in the conduct of Henry VIII, for instance, that might mean something to this kind of argument that Rousseau's trying to make. Rousseau says that, quote, "Wherever the clergy is a corporate body, it is master and legislator in its own country," end quote. Such states, Rousseau claims, have, quote, "two powers and two sovereigns," end quote. Or no sovereigns, since they're not actually real and don't really exist. It's also worth noting that the clergy is not a legitimate sovereign either, since it excludes most of the people. They are forced, but not bound, to obey, as Rousseau has mentioned in Book 3, Chapter 10, for instance. It's really weird that Rousseau is talking about this tiny corporate body and saying that it has a sovereignty to itself, and then talking about this government that's totalitarian, that has a sovereign of itself, and saying, oh, well, there's two sovereigns, but neither of these sovereigns is actually, the people, as Rousseau says that it's supposed to be. Both of them are these tiny groups that are typically going for their own personal, enrichment. But then Rousseau goes on to talk about Hobbes. He says, quote, "Hobbes alone has seen the evil and how to remedy it, and has dared to propose the reunion of the two heads of the eagle. But he should have seen that the masterful spirit of Christianity is incompatible with his system, and that the priestly interest would always be stronger than that of the state," end quote. I mean, sometimes, but the priestly interest is frequently not stronger than that of the state. But of course, the problem with a Leviathan is that no man is bound to obey an authority he has not freely agreed to. To admit that ideas like implied consent and so on are potentially valid is an invitation to slavery. It leaves mankind all the way back at might makes right, which also implies that any man, no matter how humble of station, is perfectly morally justified in attempting whatever violence he can accomplish onto state enforcers and executives to, eliminate their power over himself. This is not a stable system. This is something where there's always going to be the potential for someone to say, "You are so bad that I, will give up my life to try to stop you." Right? And that's no matter what, as long as a government does things in such a way that people can have that position in a reasonable sense, there's going to be no limit to the amount of violence that you're going to end up with. Rousseau says that Christianity is neither irrelevant to the body politic nor a support. Quote, "No state has ever been founded without a religious basis. And the law of Christianity at bottom does more harm by weakening than good by strengthening the constitution of the state," end quote. He's using a very expansive definition of religion, or I guess we should use an expansive definition of religion, and if we do that, then Rousseau is kind of right here. But his earlier statements that the form of government depends on the people, etc., from, say, Book 3, Chapter 8, mean that he can't just declare this, he actually has to argue why it couldn't become true in the future, right? That's the problem with this argument from, we haven't seen it in the past. Well, you have to provide a logical reason why we might not see it in the future. But we also recall that Rousseau is generally hostile to innovation anyway. So, he kind of assumes that the citizens of a republic should generally remain relatively poor and undifferentiated, subsistence farmers. We can look back at, say, Book 2, Chapter 10, and multiple references from beyond that. Now, next up, Rousseau goes on to delineate three different types of religion. Number one, an internal religion of man, within yourself entirely, basically. Number two, an external religion of country. And number three, a religion that, quote, "gives men two codes of legislation, two rulers, and two countries," end quote. And then he does this kind of quiz show thing where he talks about them in a weird order. He talks about how the third type, the two codes, two rulers, two countries type, makes it impossible for citizens to be faithful to both state and religion. And he's demanding faith in the state, which is already a bit of a problem. He gives examples of the lamas in I assume, what was it, Nepal, right? The Japanese, and he also puts Roman Christianity into this boat. He says that this type is, quote, "so clearly bad that it is waste of time to stop to prove it such." I think there's a missing A there, like a typo. All that destroys social unity is worthless. All institutions that set man in contradiction to himself are worthless, end quote. Now, these are strong words, but if we look at them, we see that where Rousseau is going with this. It's bad from the perspective of enacting a totalitarian state that can do whatever it wants to do. Maybe it's not so bad if that's not one of your assumptions. It's also worth noting that these systems thrived for hundreds of years, underwent various conquests, expansions, contractions, etc., and in fact there's still a Dalai Lama today. If nothing else is to convince us that Rousseau is judging based on an overly restrictive assumption, it should be this fact, that these quote-unquote impossible to work with religions actually have survived for hundreds and hundreds of years, and have had successful and less successful and unsuccessful governments, all based on, certain principles and having people in them that observe these religions. Then he goes on to talk about religion type number 2, the external religion of country. And he says that this type of religion unites divinity with, quote, love of the laws, making country the object of the citizens' adoration, teaches them that service done to the state is service done to its tutelary God, end quote. He goes on, but the point is that only government functionaries are religious figures under this type of religion. However, he says, quote, he says it is also, quote, founded on lies and error, end quote. At least he acknowledges that if the government were to make up a religion to support itself, that religion wouldn't necessarily have any real basis. He goes on to note that it creates superstition and that it can be, quote, tyrannous and exclusive, and makes a people bloodthirsty and intolerant, end quote. It forces its people into a state of war with the rest of the world and thus endangers the longevity of the state. And that's the reason why Rousseau doesn't like religion of the country, solely because it causes that country to be belligerent and likely get, attacked by a bunch of other countries. The thing is that if there were a country that didn't have to worry about being invaded by other countries, Rousseau would be just fine with this type of religion being brought up and forced upon the people. It's also worth noting that this is very similar to the type of religion that Plato talked about in the Republic. And Rousseau doesn't often distance himself from Plato, but this is one of those times. And for the sake of argument, it's worth noting that, hypothetically assuming that there is some God, that maybe one nation somewhere is actually entitled to this position. But Rousseau has no way of determining whether that is true or not of any given country, and neither do we. Now, the internal type of religion that Rousseau is talking about, he goes on to say that this one tells men that they are all brothers, which Rousseau believes to be a good thing, and also doesn't affect the body politic, which Rousseau also thinks is a good thing. However, Rousseau says, it makes laws only as powerful as the force behind them. That is to say, there's no, awe that the people have in looking at the laws, and Rousseau thinks that people should see the laws as a subject of awe. And of course the obvious counter is that, well, what if we just had laws that people voluntarily agreed to? They don't need to have awe, they just need to say, yes, I agree to this, and sign on the dotted line. But of course, you can't have big enough states that way, so Rousseau's like, no way. Rousseau continues with a discourse on what he calls true Christians, and he says that people like this would be good and they'd be dutiful, but they'd also be very focused on the next world, not this one. Therefore, there's no unity and no martial spirit of these types of people. They're easily twisted also by one untrue man, like a Cromwell, gathering power, and then too willing to suffer in this world under an abusive prince. He talks about how their soldiers, because they're not focused on this world but are willing to die, would be, quote, beaten, crushed, and destroyed, end quote, since they wouldn't really have an attachment to this world. He talks about a different emperor whose soldiers didn't promise to die for the country, but promised to win and come back alive, and he sees that as superior. Of course, this is a highly idealized version of, in Rousseau's mind, of what an ideal Christian is. And he talks about it as if it's something that's already predetermined and there's no possible counter-argument or alternative interpretation of Holy Writ, right? There are, of course, some members of every sect of Christianity that believe themselves to be the true Christians, and they all have different ideas and applications of what they believe to be the Word of God. Furthermore, Rousseau is examining some kind of idealized follower of some idealized Christianity, which might not even exist in any meaningful numbers. And this is also a case of him kind of abstracting far away from his promise to look at man as he really is, all the way from the beginning of the book. Rousseau makes a bit of analysis here. He says that Christian troops were powerful under pagan leaders, and they emulated good pagan soldiers, and that's why they were good. But once the emperors themselves were Christian, the Christian troops kind of lost their efficacy. They didn't have any pagan soldiers to look up to. And then Rousseau goes on to note, or to state, or to argue, not even argue, but just kind of to suggest that the Crusaders were good, but they were good because they were the soldiers of the priesthood and not soldiers of a state. But of course, the priests that the Crusaders worked for weren't pagans, right? So why would the Crusaders under the priests who were also Christians be any better than those under Christian emperors? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, just logically. But at the same time, it's hard to see what Rousseau's point here is, other than that strong belief in an afterlife might make a person cling less tenaciously to this one, which is, I think, a tenuous overgeneralization at best. Now, it's here that we get something else that we've seen a couple of times, and it's one of those things where Rousseau tries to save himself in the eyes of readers. There's a footnote, and there's a lead-up to it. Okay, quote, "The right which the social compact gives the sovereign over the subjects does not, we have seen, exceed the limits of public expediency," end quote. That's in the main text. And then he goes to a footnote where he attributes this quote to Marquis de Argenson. Quote, "In the Republic, each man is perfectly free in what does not harm others," end quote. Which Rousseau goes on to pontificate on himself. Quote, "This is the invariable limitation which it is impossible to define more exactly," end quote. Well, first off, that's a negative, and we're not going to be able to prove that. But this is something that we've seen Rousseau do a couple of times. He pays a little lip service to the idea that his framework permits all acts that aren't torts, right? It sounds very libertarian. But we always have to remember his statement from earlier. Quote, "Each man alienates, I admit, by the social compact, only such part of his powers, goods, and liberty as it is important for the community to control. But it must also be granted that the sovereign is sole judge of what is important," end quote. That's from Book 2, Chapter 4. And it shows that even if Rousseau pays a little bit of lip service to the idea that, oh, well, the sovereign can't do X, actually the sovereign can do X. Rousseau just wants us to think that it can't so that we are more likely to promote his awful system. But here's where things really go off the rails. Next up, Rousseau says that the sovereign needs to create religious-style rules, dogmas he calls them, that determine what makes, quote, "a good citizen or a faithful subject," end quote. He says that states should banish those who do not believe or follow these rules, as such people are, quote, "antisocial," end quote. And then he says that if someone publicly recognizes these rules, dogmas, and then later acts against them, by whose judgment, that the penalty for that should be death for, quote, "lying before the law," end quote. This, of course, sounds suspiciously like Plato's scheme with a little coat of paint over it. But he continues, and it gets worse. He says that the dogmas should be, quote, "few, simple, and exactly worded without explanation or commentary," end quote. The suggested rules are the, quote, "existence of a mighty, intelligent, and beneficent divinity, possessed of foresight and providence, the life to come, the happiness of the just, the punishment of the wicked, the sanctity of the social contract, and the laws. These are its positive dogmas. Its negative dogmas I confine to one, intolerance, which is a part of the cults we have rejected," end quote. So, Rousseau is demanding that the state create its own public religion that puts the laws of the state on the same level as divinity. He's basically attempting to hijack people's views of God and to force those onto adoration of the state, and he does so with massive potential penalties, which would be expropriation of all of your property and banishment, or death. Great. This sounds like great stuff. And it's worth noting that these dogmas that have just come out of nowhere in this chapter were not mentioned in Rousseau's earlier chapter on the separations of the law. We're talking about Book 2, Chapter 12. So are these doctrines, these dogmas, law, or are they not? And why weren't they mentioned earlier? These place very powerful and psychologically crushing bindings on the people and punish them in ways that they probably did not expect if and when they joined the social contract. Rousseau says, quote, "It is impossible to live at peace with those we regard as damned. To love them would be to hate God who punishes them. We positively must either reclaim or torment them." End quote. That is a false dichotomy, or a false dilemma, if I've ever heard one. Different sects, of course, have different levels of evangelism. Rousseau is just plain wrong here because someone can make a moral judgment without justifying aggression against the sinner. There can be different tiers of things that you can be justified in doing. To sweep all this under the rug is to get rid of the ability of people to distinguish between different levels of good and evil. But moreover, certain doctrines that people have held don't actually connect salvation to morality directly. I'm thinking of, I believe it was Calvinism that had the concept of grace, right? And so it didn't really matter what you did, but at the same time, you were going to be compelled to do good, ? And then that would lead to your grace and therefore salvation. I'm not an expert in there, but it's not like good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell. It's much more weird than that. And so, of course, what we're discovering is that Rousseau is an unimaginative mess here, and he's just saying things that aren't true. He goes on to say that theological intolerance inevitably leads to civil effects and subjugates the prince to the priests, which, again, is true if you have a totalitarian prince. But if you have a voluntary or limited state, then that's not true at all. You can have the state have authority here, and the church have authority here, and they can be separated. This is not hard to understand. But, of course, Rousseau's framework doesn't permit that. The sovereign must have 100% power to determine everything, and the sovereign is also imaginary. It's also worth noting that by saying that theological intolerance leads to civil effects, and that's a problem, is that he's just stripped freedom of conscience from everyone, literally. This is bad stuff. Now Rousseau says that we need tolerance to all tolerant religions as long as their dogmas do not contradict, quote, duties of citizenship. That is to say, every religion must believe in the state, and if the religion does not believe in the state, then it is intolerant. This is 200 years before, I believe it was Herbert Marcuse, who would try to pull the same silliness of liberating tolerance. Basically, Rousseau is demanding that all religions subjugate themselves to the state, which kind of restricts what they can actually say in a pretty significant way. And remember how he said that Christians were too worried about the next life? Now he's saying that the state should control how people perceive or understand or believe the next life works, because all religions must subjugate themselves to the state. This is a level of totalitarianism that I did not anticipate, and I certainly did not imagine was going to pop up out of nowhere in the last chapter of the book. But this is pretty horrifying. This is Rousseau saying, if your religion doesn't support the state and the state dogmas that should be this but might not be, right? That religion needs to be destroyed by the government, and the people need to be re-educated into the religion of the state. And he finishes with this, quote, "But whoever dares to say outside the church is no salvation ought to be driven from the state, unless the state is the church and the prince the pontiff," end quote. Different religions should be nice to each other, and the state, especially the state, or else. Whew. So this is pretty bad. In the last chapter, Rousseau stripped freedom of conscience from his people that he's already stripped everything else from. Property, freedom, everything. And then he does this for chapter 9. Chapter 9 is just called Conclusion. And I'm just going to read this chapter in its entirety because it's a single paragraph. Here we go. Quote, "Now that I have laid down the true principles of political right and tried to give the state a basis of its own to rest on, I ought next to strengthen it by its external relations, which would include the law of nations, commerce, the right of war and conquest, public right, leagues, negotiations, treaties, etc. But all this forms a new subject that is far too vast for my narrow scope. I ought throughout to have kept to a more limited sphere." End quote. And this is a typical way to end this kind of nonsense. Oh, of course, this can all be applied to all these other spheres of activity, but I'm not going to say how. Nah, it's fine. At this point, I think we've let him tie himself into enough knots already. And now it's time for my conclusions and summary. Man, it has been nearly, or approximately 5 months of this book, going through it chapter by chapter, and the final conclusion is that Rousseau's framework is hopelessly totalitarian. It takes classical liberal language and twists it into creating this monster state. The state is encouraged by Rousseau, word for word, it is encouraged to impoverish everyone and to maintain them at roughly subsistence levels. This, of course, creates beleaguered permanent minorities that have a beef with the state but no way to ever free themselves from its grip. There is no examination of incentives and very little of possible downsides in this entire book. Rousseau just says, this is how it should be, and I sure hope it is, and kind of waddles off into the next area. There's a should or an ought, but there's nothing in the system itself that encourages it to move in that direction, and often there's things in the system that encourage it to move in the opposite direction. No part of his system is vulnerable to objective measurement, to determine whether it's working properly or not, right? Everything is based on these fictitious constructs that a tyrannical government would easily use to justify its exploitation of the people. It's the general will. It's the same thing we've been hearing all the way since Teddy Roosevelt for every nonsensical progressive policy idea. Rousseau relies on this hypothetical legislator or legislators to write the laws, and the people will then ratify the laws in happy days. But there's no guarantee that this weird angelic character will ever be found, and there's no way to distinguish a bad legislator from a good one except by popular vote, which is vulnerable to all sort of crazy mob mentality nonsense. Rousseau kind of vacillates between saying the state should be upheld as long as possible, and then he gives these various foggy statements giving these extremely low bars for dissolving the state. This is fundamentally confused, and it serves to encourage governments not to be better, but to pretend harder. It creates plenty of opportunities for splinter groups, whether with good or bad intentions, to either try to topple or gain control of the state apparatus. And, if we've read our Hayek, we know that, generally speaking, the worst try to get on top. The whole thing is so confused that it might end up even more violent than a plain, pure tyranny of domination. But even if it were clear, the first thing the Rousseauian state does is to ensure that the people are far too weak to defend themselves against its edicts. What this means is a lot of innocent people lose their lives because they believe they're being forced, not bound, to obey. The book is full of logical contradictions. The one that jumped out at me most in my memory was the tyrant-despot distinction in Book 3, Chapter 10, where he says, all tyrants are despots, but no despots are tyrants. It's just logical gibberish that he throws out and doesn't really justify. There's also Book 2, Chapter 2, where he talks about the indivisibility of the sovereign, how people are crazy when they're making these separations and calling this part of the state this, and this part of the state that, and then he does the same thing over and over and over again throughout the rest of the book. He has these bleating assurances that, oh no, he's not contradicting himself, you're just reading him wrong. But he uses sloppy language, he reuses and misuses terms all the time, and he has these bizarre definitions, especially bizarre definitions that take an already existing word and twist it into something completely different. Rousseau says repeatedly that the form of government depends on the people, right? But then he spends chapters and chapters idolizing Rome without really making it clear which lessons he thinks are worth learning from the Roman Republic. He talks about proper government types using a single axis, population, and ignores all others. It's very weird, very reductive, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He is completely allergic to any kind of check and balance, which further cements in the worst possible incentives into his system. he uses language from classical liberals. I said this before. And their intentions, however flawed their intentions were, was to step away from might makes right. But he takes those terms, and as I said, he twists them into the most horrible totalitarian nightmare that you can imagine. All of the failings of the classical liberals are turned up to 11, and then every possible failure of a classical liberal state is practically guaranteed to happen immediately in a Rousseauian framework. It is incredibly dangerous because his use of this language blurs the line between a large but limited state and an unlimited state. Rousseau's framework creates not just a wolf in sheep's clothing, like the Fabian socialists, but more like a Grendel in sheep's clothing. It's really, really scary because, at any moment, the sovereign can just say, no, you don't have that anymore. And no one can really say what the sovereign's actually saying. And most of the time, it's the state, the prince, that does so. And then it gets worse because in the last significant chapter of the book, he literally strips freedom of conscience from the citizens, leaving them with nothing but the right to vote and to be counted when the government decides that he may. And, hope for the best, basically. What this basically teaches is a way for a limited state, in principle, if such a thing were possible, to change itself into an unlimited state without telling anybody. This is a tyrant's you-know-what dream, right? It's like, oh, I can take this government that's limited and has principles, and I can wash all those principles away, and nobody will be the wiser? Sign me up. That's exactly what I want. And that's not what any sane person actually wants for himself. He's just hoping that he'll be the ruler, generally speaking. And so, I'm going to close this out, once again, with a Ralph Raico quote from The Struggle for Liberty. I used this as one of the intro quotes a while back, but we're going to read the whole thing in its entirety to finish this guy up. Here we go. Quote, "Does Rousseau say he's going to strike off the chains? No. He says, how can that be made legitimate? Do you follow what I'm saying? Scholars don't seem to be able to get what Rousseau's talking about here. He's talking about how to legitimate the enslaved condition, or relatively enslaved condition, of human beings in society," end quote. And so what can I say? I was expecting this to be bad, but it got way worse than I expected it to be. Kropotkin at least had some idealistic nonsense that he was trying to go back on. And he at least had some ideas of like, this will all work out because people are generally good kind of thing. But Rousseau's system is literally a framework to take like the best possible like Lockean, Jeffersonian government and turn it into a totalitarian nightmare with the people still believing that they live in the Lockean, Lockean Jeffersonian limited state. It's terrifying. And then at the very end, he literally anticipates Herbert Marcuse's liberating tolerance, liberating blah, 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 200 years before they actually happened. It's terrifying. And so that's what we've got. It's hopelessly totalitarian. It's hopelessly illogical. It does absolutely nothing to get rid of bad incentives. And, Rousseau just kind of hopes things are going to be good. It is, in fact, a path away from freedom toward slavery. And for anyone to believe that it isn't that is probably just them trying to trick you into being the slave. All right, that's what I've got. Rousseau's social contract. Yeah. If you want to write something where you talk about ideal governments, it's probably a good idea to actually make some logical arguments rather than just stating things and then wandering off to the next topic. Yeah, it'll make your book longer, but at the same time, and maybe, you won't be able to cover as much material, but at the same time, you'll make more sense and you won't plop out this kind of nonsense. Wow. Anyway, that's what I've got for today. Enjoyed is the wrong word. I hope you found this interesting and enlightening. And realize that because a lot of books like this, they get dismissed in a single sentence. And, I found that to be a little bit unsatisfying. And so I'm hoping that, you might also take a look at this book with my notes alongside if you feel that they're helpful. But these things are way more insidious than people believe, and people oversimplify how easy it is to tell the difference between, a limited government and an unlimited government, and they pretend that it's super easy, when Rousseau literally created a system that makes it impossible to tell the difference by design. So yeah, hope you found this interesting. We'll be starting something else soon, hopefully. And have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time. As always, if you like the channel, like what I'm doing, there are links in the description as to how you can help out the channel, as well as the usual your social media stuff that you can do, sharing, likes, and blah, blah, all that good stuff. Anyway, thanks again, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your week.